Imagine walking into a federal building in Washington, D.C. in the year 1913.
Okay, setting the scene.
Right. So you are a senior clerk. You happen to be a black man who has worked at the Treasury Department for over a decade.
A very stable, respected position.
Exactly. You've passed all the civil service exams, you've earned your position completely through merit, and, you've sat alongside white colleagues in a shared office space for years.
Right, because the civil service was actually one of the few meritocratic paths back then.
Yeah, but then today you walk in and overnight, literally without a single word of warning, physical wooden screens have been constructed right around your desk.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have been placed in a cage, basically, just to hide you from the sight of your white coworkers.
It is just a staggering image to contemplate. And I mean, we aren't talking about a private business in the Deep South during the height of Jim Crow here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about the federal government of the United States,
Mm-hmm.
operating right in the nation's capital, deliberately and systematically restructuring its own physical architecture just to segregate its employees.
That specific scenario is going to be central to our discussion today because, well, it shatters this comforting narrative we often tell ourselves about historical progress.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative of inevitable progress.
Exactly. We tend to view the struggle for civil rights like the construction of a skyscraper. You lay the foundation, you put up the steel beams, and floor by floor, you just keep getting higher.
Right, and you assume that once a floor is built, it is permanently there. It's solid.
Yeah. But then you step into the actual lived history of equality and freedom in this country, and that skyscraper metaphor just completely falls apart.
Because the history of civil rights is not a permanent steel building. It really isn't. It is much closer to a tidal beach.
Oh, a tidal beach. I like that.
Yeah, think about it. You can build a magnificent, highly engineered structure on the sand, right? But if you do not actively maintain a seawall, the tide of retrenchment will inevitably come rushing in to erode those foundations.
And just wash the entire structure away.
Exactly. It is the absolute definition of a cyclical struggle. It's this violent push and pull between profound advancement and, frankly, devastating federal retreat.
Welcome to this deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us today because today's source material, it completely rewired my understanding of how political eras actually connect to one another.
It's a heavy one for sure.
It is, and it demands that we throw out our standard partisan scoreboards. Today we are unpacking a really fascinating academic paper. It's titled A Black African Descendant's Perspective on the Similarities Between Presidents Rutherford B. Hayes, Woodrow Wilson, and Donald Trump.
A very specific and very long title.
Right. And the author is Chimamat Dogon McWilson, who is a master's student at the Kemetic Africology African World Exploratory University.
It is a deeply complex, highly unorthodox document, I have to say.
Yeah, it really is.
Even before we get to the core thesis,
Yeah.
the visual emblem associated with this source, the logo for the African World Exploratory University, or AWE for short.
Yeah, let's talk about the logo.
It sets the stage for an analytical approach you just rarely see in modern political science. The logo uses these bold red, black, green, and gold colors.
Very striking.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And sitting right in the center, inside an oval, is the Ankh.
The ancient Egyptian symbol of life.
Exactly. Which signals to the reader immediately that the author is entirely abandoning the standard modern political lenses of American history.
Okay, so we're not doing the usual Democrat versus Republican thing.
Right. We aren't going to be evaluating these presidencies through the framework of modern conservatism or liberalism. Not at all.
Good to know.
We're going to be evaluating them through an ancient philosophical framework that predates the United States by thousands of years.
Which brings us to the mission of this deep dive, because what we are going to do is unpack how three specific U.S. presidencies, so Hayes in 1877, Wilson in 1913, and the policies associated with Trump in 2025.
Spanning a massive amount of time.
Right, nearly 150 years. We're going to see how they represent three distinctly different mechanical methods of federal withdrawal from Black advancement.
And even though these leaders are separated by all those decades, the author draws a chillingly direct line between their administrative actions.
A very direct line. And ultimately, we want to discover the specific advocacy lessons the author lays out so you, listening right now, can understand how to actually sustain civil rights in the modern era.
And I think we need a quick disclaimer here, because the author is tackling highly charged modern political figures alongside the historical ones.
Oh, absolutely. That is vital. We need to establish the boundaries of our analysis today.
Right.
The source material evaluates specific policies from leaders representing both major American political parties. Our goal here, and we want to be crystal clear about this, our goal is not to validate or invalidate the modern Republican or Democratic platforms.
It's not our job today.
Not at all. We are looking at this strictly through the author's specific historical and philosophical lens. We're just going to explore, synthesize, and impartially dissect the mechanical arguments presented by McWilson.
We are your guides through the architecture of this paper, nothing more.
Exactly. So let's start with that architecture, because the author introduces an analytical lens called Kemetic Africology.
Yes, Kemetic Africology.
So let me just play devil's advocate right out of the gate here.
Go for it.
Applying a Kemetic Africology lens to American presidents, I mean, isn't that mixing apples and oranges?
I can see why you'd ask this.
Like, how does the author actually justify using an ancient Egyptian spiritual framework to measure the impact of modern American bureaucratic red tape?
Well, it is a fair skepticism, for sure, but the author's application of this framework is intensely practical.
Okay, how so?
Kemetic Africology, at least in the context of this specific paper, functions as an outcome-based metric.
Outcome-based.
Right. It completely removes the traditional left-wing versus right-wing scoreboard.
Which is refreshing, honestly.
It is. Instead of judging a government's actions by what a political party claims its intentions are, this perspective evaluates actions strictly by the ancient Kemetic principles of Ma'at.
And the text lists 6 specific principles of Ma'at. I have them right here.
Yeah.
Truth, justice, balance, reciprocity, righteousness, and order.
Those 6 principles are the ultimate measuring stick.
Okay.
So instead of asking, is this a constitutionally conservative policy or is this a progressive liberal policy? The framework demands that we ask a purely functional mechanical question.
Which is?
Does this specific government action expand or diminish the practical ability of Black people to exercise their political, economic, educational, and civil rights?
Oh, I see. Okay, let's unpack this. It's like evaluating a diet.
A diet.
Yeah, evaluating a diet not by the brand name on the box or the marketing claims, but by actually examining the nutritional macros.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right, like it just cuts through the marketing entirely. You stop caring if the box says healthy choice and you just look at the back and ask, is this actually nourishing my body or is it filled with refined sugar?
That is exactly it. You are ignoring the packaging and looking entirely at the functional systemic output.
Makes total sense.
And when you apply that systemic test of Ma'at to these 3 presidents, the partisan packaging becomes totally irrelevant.
Right, because they are all over the political map.
Exactly. As the author points out, Rutherford B. Hayes was a Republican.
Right.
Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat.
Okay.
Donald Trump is a Republican.
Yeah.
So if you are only looking at the party label, you miss the systemic pattern entirely.
So the author's point is that neither major party has consistently guaranteed justice or balance for Black Americans.
Precisely. The true measure is the presence or absence of Ma'at.
Truth and balance.
Right. Is there truth in the application of the law? Is there balance in how resources and protections are distributed?
That's the real test.
Because when government policies remove essential protections from vulnerable populations, or when they institutionalize inequality within their own ranks,
Yeah.
or when they dismantle mechanisms that were specifically designed to correct historical injustice, well, they violate the fundamental spirit of Ma'at.
And they do so regardless of what party affiliation the president holds or what century they happen to govern in.
Exactly.
Wow. So to really see this cycle in action, this cycle of advancement and retrenchment, and to understand how the balance of Ma'at is violently disrupted, we need to rewind the clock.
We do. We have to go back.
We need to go back to a moment of just breathtaking progress that was suddenly structurally halted. So let's travel back to the year 1877. The Rutherford B. Hayes era.
Okay, 1877. This is perhaps the most pivotal, devastating moment in the post-Civil War era.
It really is.
And the author uses it as the foundational archetype of federal retreat. But to understand the sheer magnitude of the retreat, we first have to rigorously define the advancement.
Right. You can't understand the fall without knowing how high they climbed.
That's exactly.
The text sets the scene during Reconstruction. And we are just talking about the theoretical end of slavery on paper.
No, this was concrete Massive change.
The gains being made by Black Americans in the late 1860s and early 1870s were unprecedented in global history.
Truly unprecedented.
We're talking about the rapid passage and enforcement of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Right.
You had Black citizens voting in massive numbers. You had Black men holding public office. Serving as mayors, state legislators.
Even U.S. senators.
Yeah. Guys like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi.
Sitting in the Senate chamber.
They were serving on juries, building businesses, and actively directing state governments across the South.
It was an explosion of democratic participation.
It really was.
But the author makes a critical observation about this period, and this is key for the Mayat framework.
Okay, what's that?
That participation wasn't just happening organically because, the moral arc of the universe magically bent toward justice on its own.
Right. It wasn't just good vibes.
No. It was happening because it was being actively militarily protected.
Federal troops.
Yes, federal troops were stationed throughout the South. The federal government had passed the Enforcement Acts, which were specifically designed to crush the Ku Klux Klan and protect Black voters at the polls.
So the federal government was providing a very physical, undeniable shield.
A literal military shield.
But that brings us to the presidential election of 1876.
Yes, the turning point.
And this isn't just a normal transition of power. This is one of the most disputed, chaotic elections in American history.
It was a complete mess.
You have Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, going up against Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. And the electoral votes in several southern states are fiercely contested. The nation is basically teetering on the edge of a second civil war.
People genuinely thought fighting would break out again.
And to resolve that deadlock, to secure the presidency and prevent another war, this backroom political deal is struck.
The Compromise of 1877.
Right. Hayes, the Republican, is given the presidency. But in exchange, he agrees to a massive concession.
A fatal concession.
He promises to withdraw the remaining federal troops from the South, specifically pulling the last federal garrisons out of Louisiana and South Carolina.
He pulls the troops out.
He does. Now, let's talk about the mechanics of what happens next, because the text details an immediate, devastating domino effect.
It is chilling how fast it all fell apart.
It's terrifying how fast the infrastructure of equality collapses without that federal shield.
Huh.
Once the troops leave, the federal government effectively renounces its jurisdiction over civil rights in the South.
They just wash their hands of it.
Yeah, and organized white supremacist violence, which had been, somewhat suppressed by the military presence.
Right, it was kept in check.
Suddenly, it begins to operate entirely in the open, often literally hand in hand with local law enforcement.
And the political purge is instantaneous. Black elected officials are violently driven from office, or they're simply legislated out of existence.
Disappeared from public life.
Exactly. But the author focuses heavily on the structural mechanisms that replace the federal protection.
The plumbing, so to speak.
Right. We see the rapid, systematic invention of Jim Crow segregation and voter suppression laws.
So, explain the plumbing of that suppression to us, because they couldn't just repeal the 15th Amendment, right?
No, they couldn't.
The Constitution still technically said you couldn't deny the right to vote based on race.
Right, so they didn't need to repeal it. They just bypassed it structurally.
How do you bypass an amendment?
Well, without federal oversight, southern states implemented poll taxes.
Okay, charging money to vote.
Exactly. Charging a fee to vote, which intentionally disenfranchised newly freed, economically disadvantaged Black citizens.
Because they obviously wouldn't have the cash to spare just to cast a ballot.
Right. Then they implemented absurdly complex literacy tests.
Oh, I've seen some of these tests. They are completely impossible.
They were designed to be impossible. And they were administered by white registrars who would just pass illiterate white voters and fail highly educated Black voters based on completely arbitrary rules.
It's just blatantly rigged.
Totally rigged. And then, the final piece of the puzzle, they implemented grandfather clauses.
Right, the grandfather clauses. Remind me how those worked.
A grandfather clause basically stated that you were legally exempt from the poll tax or the literacy test if your grandfather had the right to vote before the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was a neat legal trick that explicitly excluded all descendants of enslaved people.
Because obviously none of their grandfathers could vote before the Civil War.
Exactly. While simultaneously protecting poor, illiterate white voters who would have otherwise been caught in the net of the poll tax or the literacy test.
So they basically re-engineered the state laws to achieve the exact outcome of total disenfranchisement without ever actually using the word race in the statutes.
Precisely. It was a rapid systemic collapse of all the unprecedented political and civil gains of Reconstruction.
And here is the profound irony that the author highlights, which makes evaluating this through the lens of Ma'at so incredibly compelling.
Right. Hayes's personal beliefs.
Yes. Rutherford B. Hayes personally opposed slavery.
He did.
He was a Republican, the party of Lincoln. He had served as a general in the Union Army.
He bled for the Union.
Yeah. And he personally supported black voting rights.
In theory.
Right. So how does a president with those stated personal intentions cause this much generational damage?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this is exactly why the author's comedic framework is necessary.
Because intentions don't matter.
Intentions do not matter. Outcomes do. From the Black African descendant perspective outlined in the paper, Hayes represents a very specific method of retreat, the method of withdrawal.
Withdrawal. Right, because it's not like Hayes sat in the Oval Office and personally drafted the grandfather clauses or the literacy test.
No, he certainly didn't write them himself. But by removing the only enforcement mechanism capable of actually protecting black citizens, the federal troops, he completely abandoned the federal government's constitutional responsibility.
He just walked away.
He allowed a massive power vacuum to form, fully knowing what forces would rush in to fill it.
It's like building a state-of-the-art security system for a really vulnerable house.
Okay, I'm following.
You build this amazing system to protect the people inside, but then to save on the electric bill or to appease a neighbor you're arguing with, you just decide to unplug it.
Right.
You didn't break into the house yourself. But by unplugging the system, the destruction of that house is absolutely your structural legacy. The house is still technically there, but the protection is gone, so it gets annihilated by the invaders.
And that is the author's core lesson from the Hayes era. Rights without enforcement become entirely vulnerable to destruction.
They are just words on paper.
Literally just ink. It simply does not matter what the 14th or 15th Amendments say if the federal executive branch refuses to provide the structural mechanism to enforce them.
Returning to our comedic Africology framework, withdrawing protection from a vulnerable population violates the fundamental principles of balance, justice, and righteousness.
Completely violates them.
The scales of Ma were violently tipped in favor of those seeking to oppress, simply because the federal government decided its own political convenience was more important than its citizens' lives.
So Hayes represents the era of passive withdrawal.
He opened the floodgates and looked the other way.
Exactly. But if Hayes showed the devastating damage of federal absence, surely future administrations recognized this and attempted to correct it, right?
You would think so, but actually no, and this is where the source material gets incredibly dark.
Yeah, it really takes a turn.
Because as we move forward to our next president, the dynamic changes drastically. If Hayes removed the shield, our next president didn't just stand by.
No, he took a much more active role.
He actively turned the weapons of the federal government inward. He actively built walls.
We are fast-forwarding to 1913, the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson.
The Wilson era.
And the method of federal retreat shifts here. It goes from passive withdrawal to active administrative reversal.
The author categorizes the Wilson era as the institutionalization of federal segregation.
Institutionalized.
Yeah. Let's really dig into the mechanics of this, because it isn't just about societal prejudice or people holding racist views.
The structural.
The details provided in the text regarding Wilson's administration are just stark. His cabinet took major, powerful federal agencies, specifically the Post Office and the Treasury Department, and explicitly resegregated them.
We have to understand what the federal civil service represented for Black Americans prior to Wilson coming into office.
It was a big deal, right?
It was a massive deal. Since the post-Civil War era, the federal government had been one of the very few places where a Black citizen could secure a stable, middle-class job.
Because of the exams.
Right, based on a relatively meritocratic civil service exam. If you scored well, you got the job. You had Black clerks, supervisors, and postal workers working right alongside white colleagues.
Sharing the same desks, eating in the same cafeterias.
It was a rare pocket of integrated economic mobility in a country that was otherwise deeply segregated.
And Wilson decides to actively dismantle that.
He does.
Let's go back to the hook I mentioned at the very start of this deep dive. The physical screens.
The cages.
Yeah, the text specifically mentions the use of physical barriers. How did the bureaucracy actually justify building cages around its own employees? What was the official excuse?
It is wild. Wilson's cabinet officials, guys like Postmaster General Albert Burleson and Treasury Secretary William McAdoo, they argued that segregation was legally necessary to, quote, reduce friction and promote efficiency among workers.
Reduce friction. That is such a cold, bureaucratic euphemism.
Right, and under that absurd guise of efficiency, they began a sweeping restructuring of the physical workspace.
So what did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, they ordered the construction of physical wooden screens to separate black clerks from white clerks in the exact same room. They assigned separate and usually far inferior bathroom facilities down in the basements. They created separate cafeterias.
It's astounding, building a physical wall between desks. But it wasn't just about the physical space, was it?
No, the physical space was just the tip of the iceberg.
The author details a much deeper structural economic purge that happened alongside this.
The physical screens were really just the visible manifestation of a much broader economic algorithm of inequality.
An algorithm of inequality, that's a great way to put it.
Because suddenly, black employees were denied promotions, entirely regardless of their civil service scores or their tenure.
So merit went right out the window.
Completely. Many experienced workers were systematically demoted to lower-paying, menial roles just so they wouldn't be managing white employees.
Wow.
And to make sure it stayed that way, the federal government started requiring photographs on civil service applications for the very first time.
Oh, I didn't know that's where that came from.
Yep. It was a structural tool designed specifically to screen out black applicants before they were even allowed to take a test.
That is devious. The author dives deeply into the profound dual damage this caused, highlighting both the psychological toll and the quantifiable economic toll.
Both are critical to understand.
Let's look at the psychological message first. The text points out that Wilson didn't just tolerate discrimination in the private sector, his administration modeled it.
Modeled it for the whole country.
It communicated a devastating official message that the federal government itself viewed black citizens as second-class participants in American democracy.
And the psychological toll of that is immense. Think about it. When the highest authority in the land, the entity that is supposed to be the ultimate guarantor of equality, actively builds a cage around your desk.
It completely validates and emboldens discrimination everywhere else.
Exactly. If the U.S. Treasury Department won't treat a black man as an equal, why on earth should a private bank down in Georgia do it?
Right. It gives everyone else permission to be terrible.
It absolutely does.
But it's the concrete economic research cited in the report that really grounds this in reality for me. The author points out that this Wilson-era segregation had highly quantifiable, multi-generational negative impacts.
Yes, the text looks at the long-term data, and it is bleak.
How bad was it?
Yeah. Well, by demoting black federal workers en masse and freezing their advancement, the Wilson administration actively, mathematically reduced their lifetime earnings.
Which directly impacts their families.
And it directly limited their ability to achieve homeownership, which, as we know, was and still is the primary engine of generational wealth in America.
Here's where it gets really interesting to connect the dots. If you restrict a generation's ability to earn, to get promoted, and to build equity in a home, you are fundamentally restricting the capital they can pass down to their children.
And their grandchildren. Right. It was a cascading algorithm of inequality, officially sanctioned and engineered by the state.
So Wilson essentially recoded the operating system of the federal workforce.
That's a perfect analogy. He recoded it so that it would automatically filter out black economic advancement for decades to come.
Regardless of who was elected president next, the code was already in the machine.
Exactly.
This presents a fascinating contrast to Hayes. With Hayes, you could argue, maybe, a sin of omission. He pulled back the troops and let the state governors do the dirty work of oppressing.
Right. He looked the other way.
But with Wilson, the federal government itself is the weapon. He used the actual apparatus of the state to actively dismantle the practical ability of black people to exercise their economic and civil rights.
And returning to the text's core thesis, this is a profound violation of the principles of Ma'at.
Completely.
There is no balance, there is no truth, and there is certainly no reciprocity when the federal workplace builds physical screens to isolate, humiliate, and demote its own citizens.
So Wilson's distinct method of federal retreat was segregation, active institutionalization of inequality.
Segregation, yeah.
So you have Hayes representing the method of withdrawal and Wilson representing the method of segregation.
Correct.
That brings us to the third era highlighted in the text. And this plunges us right into the policy debates of the modern day. We are jumping from the physical screens of 1913 into the highly contested political landscape of 2025.
The modern era.
Yes, the text shifts its focus to the policies associated with the Trump era and the proposals outlined by conservative think tanks, which are often referred to as Project 2025.
And again, just to reinforce our analytical boundaries here,
Yes, let's remind everyone.
we are strictly outlining the arguments and specific policy concerns exactly as they're constructed in McWilson's paper.
Right, we aren't endorsing or attacking these platforms.
We are purely exploring how the author applies the framework of MOD to these modern policies.
So let's look at how the author frames this modern era. The text explicitly states that, unlike Wilson, President Donald Trump has not implemented formal segregation.
No, obviously not.
There are no executive orders demanding physical screens be built in federal offices.
Right.
And unlike Hayes, he hasn't withdrawn military protection because, well, that isn't really how modern civil rights are enforced anyway.
Mechanisms have changed.
So the obvious question here is, how does the author connect the modern era to these historical retreats if there are no troops leaving and no physical cages being built?
That's the million-dollar question. And the author argues that critics view the Trump-era policies, and specifically the conservative proposals for 2025, as a modern retreat from race-conscious civil rights protections.
A modern retreat.
Yes, it is a retreat executed through the method of restructuring.
Restructuring.
Yes.
Okay, the text outlines 5 specific tools or mechanisms of this modern federal retreat. Let's break down the plumbing of each one, just like we did for the poll taxes and the federal cages.
Let's do it.
Tool number 1, the elimination of federal DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Okay, so for decades, federal agencies have utilized DEI programs as structural mechanisms to identify and correct internal biases in hiring, promotion, and retention.
Right, trying to level the playing field internally.
Exactly. The modern policy push we see in the text is to completely dismantle these offices, arguing that they are inherently discriminatory themselves.
Okay, tool number 2, the revocation of affirmative action requirements for federal contractors.
This is a big one economically.
Yeah.
The federal government spends hundreds of billions of dollars on private contractors every year.
A massive amount of money.
Right. And historically, to get a piece of that money, companies had to demonstrate they were taking affirmative steps to ensure a diverse workforce. It served as a powerful economic lever for integration in the private sector.
If you want our money, you have to hire fairly.
Exactly. The modern retreat involves stripping away those requirements, which critics argue removes the economic incentive for companies to prioritize diversity at all.
Okay, I see. Tool number 3 is the reduction of federal educational oversight.
Pulling back the federal watchful eye from local school districts.
Right. Tool number 4 is the removal or aggressive review of historical materials related to Black achievement or systemic racism.
Affecting what is taught and what is accessible.
And the 5th tool, which is perhaps the most bureaucratic, but the author argues is arguably the most impactful, the weakening of federal mechanisms used to monitor racial disparities.
Let's really focus on that 5th one because it is incredibly mechanical.
The data collection.
Right. If the federal government stops requiring agencies to collect data on how policies impact different racial groups,
Then what happens?
then systemic disparities become functionally invisible. You literally cannot fix a disparity if you legally prohibit the government from measuring it in the first place.
Wow, yeah. Out of sight, out of mind, legally mandated.
Exactly.
Now, the text provides a really robust look at both sides of the legal and philosophical arguments surrounding these 5 tools.
It does.
It honors the principle of truth and balance by presenting the justification from the supporters of these policies, as well as the deep systemic concern from the critics.
Right.
So let's test both arguments. What is the justification for dismantling these programs? What do the supporters say?
The primary argument from supporters of these modern policies is based on the philosophy of a purely colorblind meritocracy.
Colorblind meritocracy.
Right. The argument states that any policy that uses race as a factor, even if it is specifically designed to help historically marginalized groups, is inherently unfair and violates the principle of equal protection.
So any mention of race is bad.
That's the argument. Supporters argue that eliminating DEI, revoking affirmative action, and stopping race-based data collection are necessary steps to dismantle an unfair system and ensure that the government treats everyone strictly as individuals, based only on merit.
And, I mean, that sounds reasonable on its face, right?
It has a very strong rhetorical appeal.
If the law is entirely colorblind, isn't that the definition of equality? But the text presents the counter-argument from critics, which deeply aligns with the Black African descendant perspective the author is establishing.
Yes, the Kemetic framework pushes back on this hard.
What is the flaw in the colorblind argument according to this framework?
The critics argue that colorblindness only produces actual equality if you are operating in a society that is already equal.
Which we clearly aren't.
Right. We live in a society with deeply unresolved historical inequalities. We just spent the last half hour talking about them.
The generational wealth gaps caused by Wilson's segregation algorithms.
Exactly. The decades of political power lost because Hayes allowed the grandfather clauses and poll taxes to flourish.
The starting line is completely staggered because of centuries of state-sponsored injustice.
So the critics argue that using race-neutral, colorblind language in a historically unequal society doesn't actually create a fair system.
What does it do?
It simply locks the existing inequality in place. It freezes the board exactly where it is.
So it's like, okay, let's say we have a foot race, a 100-meter dash.
Okay.
And one runner has been systematically held back by the officials. They've had weights tied to their ankles for the first 90 meters of the race.
Right, they're way behind.
And then suddenly, the referee blows a whistle, cuts the weights off, and announces, "We are now going to be completely blind to where everyone currently is on the track. We are just going to let the best runner win from here on out."
Right, ignoring the 90-meter deficit.
That isn't a fair race. It is just a mechanism to ensure the runner who is held back inevitably loses.
That is exactly the point the critics make.
Oh.
They argue that dismantling race-conscious programs produces and actively maintains racially unequal outcomes.
This clarifies the author's nuanced connection between 2025, 1913, and 1877.
It really pulls the thread through.
Because the modern concern isn't about the government explicitly authorizing discrimination like Wilson did. The concern is about the federal government systematically dismantling the structural tools that were specifically created to address the damage of past discrimination.
It is, as you said earlier, a retreat through restructuring.
Restructuring.
It is dismantling the civil rights infrastructure, the data monitoring, the educational oversight, the affirmative action requirements. These are the modern bureaucratic equivalents of the federal troops stationed in the South during Reconstruction.
Oh, wow. They are the mechanisms of enforcement.
Exactly. They are the shield. And just as Hayes removed the military tools of enforcement in 1877, critics argue the modern era is systematically removing the bureaucratic tools of enforcement today.
That is a chilling parallel. So, having laid out the precise mechanics of all three of these distinct eras, let us take a step back and look at the massive, overlapping pattern the author has drawn across 150 years of American history.
The big picture.
Yes, this is the common thread that ties Hayes, Wilson, and Trump together in this paper.
It's a really powerful synthesis when you look at it all at once. When we compare the methods, they are structurally distinct from one another.
Right, let's summarize them.
As the author summarizes, Hayes utilized withdrawal. He reduced protection, opening the floodgates to violence and suppression.
Wilson utilized segregation.
Right. He used the actual power of the state to institutionalize inequality within the government itself.
And Trump is associated with restructuring.
Reducing race-conscious civil rights protections and dismantling oversight.
It is a profound realization. You have entirely different administrative motives, completely different legal architectures, opposing political parties, and they are operating in entirely different centuries.
Different worlds, practically.
Yet, according to the text, the perceived outcome for Black Americans remains tragically, functionally identical.
A structural weakening of the federal commitment to protecting Black advancement.
That is the common thread.
Yes. In each case, whether by absence, by weaponization, or by bureaucratic dismantling, Black Americans experienced a decline in federal support for equality.
Which brings us right back to the beginning of our deep dive. It brings us back to the Kemetic Africology framework and the principles of Mott.
It always comes back to Mott.
Because when you view this 150-year pattern through the lens of Mott, the political justifications and the partisan packaging just completely fall away.
They don't matter at all.
No.
Because when a government increases the vulnerability of its citizens, as Hayes did,
right,
or when it engineers algorithms of inequality, as Wilson did,
yeah,
or when it dismantles the corrective mechanisms designed to heal historical wounds, as critics argue the modern era is doing.
When it does any of those things.
The fundamental spirit of balance, justice, reciprocity, and truth is violently violated.
The specific tools of retreat evolve with the times, but the systemic violation of Mott remains constant.
Sadly, yes.
Which leads us to the most crucial, forward-looking part of the text. Because the author doesn't just lay out this depressing, cyclical tidal wave of retrenchment and say, well, the beach is washed out, time to go home.
Right. It's not just a doom and gloom historical audit.
No, the text pivots to the future.
Yeah.
It asks, if history operates in these structural cycles of advancement and retrenchment, what are the specific advocacy lessons for modern citizens?
How do you actually build a seawall that lasts?
Exactly. What do we do about it?
The text is very clear that recognizing the cycle is only the first intellectual step. The enduring, practical challenge, as the author states, is that winning a right is only half the battle.
Winning it is just the beginning.
Exactly. Passing the 15th Amendment, winning a Supreme Court case, or establishing a federal DEI program that's just the initial architectural blueprint.
It's the floor of the skyscraper, going back to our earlier metaphor.
Right. But the text outlines a continuous four-step mechanical process that must follow if those rights are to actually survive the inevitable historical tide of retrenchment.
What are the 4 steps?
Rights must be protected, they must be enforced, they must be remembered, and they must be transmitted to future generations.
Protect, enforce, remember, transmit.
It is not a passive state of being. It is a mandate for continuous active vigilance.
And the author gives 3 very specific actionable verbs for the Black African descendant community and its allies to execute this mandate.
Right. Organize, educate, and advocate.
Let's break down the mechanics of those 3 verbs because I want people to really understand what this looks like in practice.
Okay, so to organize means building the resilient community and legal structures necessary to withstand political shifts.
So relying on yourselves, not just the politicians.
Exactly. It means creating coalitions and institutions that aren't dependent on whoever happens to sit in the Oval Office at any given moment.
Because the Oval Office can turn on you.
As history shows, it absolutely will.
Okay, what about educate?
To educate means ensuring that the true, unvarnished history is documented and transmitted.
The good and the bad.
Right. The precise mechanics of how Hayes enabled Jim Crow, how Wilson built physical cages, and how modern restructuring works. This knowledge must be passed down, especially when there are coordinated efforts to remove or review historical materials from public schools.
You have to know how the system was dismantled before so you can see it happening again.
Precisely. And finally, advocate.
What does that entail here?
To advocate means constantly pushing for the rigorous enforcement of protections. It means deeply understanding that civil rights are not a natural resting state of being.
Let me try an analogy here.
Please do.
I think of it less like a garden and more like physical infrastructure. Like a massive steel suspension bridge.
Oh, bridge. Okay.
Achieving a civil right is like building the bridge. It connects 2 points. It allows for progress. It is an absolute marvel of engineering.
Right.
But you can't just build the bridge, cut the ribbon, and walk away forever. You have to constantly inspect the cables. You have to scrape off the rust. You have to reinforce the concrete. And you have to fight for the municipal budget to maintain it every single year.
Because if you stop maintaining it.
The natural forces of physics, wind, and time will absolutely tear it down.
Inevitably.
The bridge collapsing isn't some magical curse or a sign that bridges don't work. It is the direct, predictable result of deferred maintenance.
That is an excellent way to frame it, and that is exactly the author's ultimate conclusion.
That we stopped doing the maintenance.
Yes. History repeating itself in these cycles of retrenchment is not some unavoidable mystical curse. It is the direct consequence of society forgetting to maintain the infrastructure of justice.
Wow.
When citizens stop organizing, educating, and advocating, they essentially defund the maintenance budget, and the bridge of equality collapses under the weight of retrenchment.
So to summarize the incredible, expansive journey this academic paper took us on today,
It was quite a journey.
we started at the breathtaking heights of Reconstruction, only to see the vital federal shield abruptly withdrawn in 1877 under Rutherford B. Hayes, which led to the systemic rise of Jim Crow.
The era of withdrawal.
We then moved to 1913, where Woodrow Wilson didn't just withdraw protection, but actively built physical cages and economic algorithms of segregation within the federal bureaucracy itself.
The era of segregation.
And finally, we navigated the modern policy debates of 2025, exploring the profound concern that eliminating race-conscious frameworks and data monitoring is a new bureaucratic form of structural retreat.
The era of restructuring.
3 profoundly different eras. 3 distinct mechanical methods: withdrawal, segregation, restructuring. but all resulting in a structurally perceived weakening of the federal commitment to equality.
A cyclical, devastating violation of the ancient principles of Ma'at. Truth, justice, balance, reciprocity, righteousness, and order.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to direct the focus straight to you, the listener, because at the very end of this source document, Jim Amat Dogon McWilson poses a series of critical structural questions.
And they aren't rhetorical.
No, they demand to be actively wrestled with. The author asks, who actually benefits when federal protections are weakened? And who systemically suffers when equality is no longer actively structurally defended?
Those are the questions that completely cut through the partisan packaging and the political noise.
They really do.
And as you go about your week, as you watch the news, and as you observe the specific policies being debated and implemented in your own time, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Ask yourself, as a society, are we actively organizing, educating, and advocating to build and maintain an infrastructure that upholds the balance and justice of Ma'at? Or are we just quietly looking away as the floodgates are opened all over again?
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives, keep looking past the political packaging to see the actual mechanics, keep learning, and above all, keep seeking balance.